Alaska, July 13th, 2017. Now going into my sophomore year of high school, I was beginning to feel as if I was too old to be going to Camp Applewood anymore. It wasn't that I had some sort of superiority complex when it came to my peers, but I felt like I was more able to identify and relate to the counselors than the campers, who were more in the age range of college students. When people think of what Alaska is like, they usually think cold, snowy, even damp perhaps. But during the summers, it could get pretty hot up there. But the current weather was perfect for the activities that usually happened in the camp. Things like football, soccer, hiking, swimming, the whole 9 yards. But today was different. Today was odd. Because on the bus, there was a strange energy. It wasn't eerie, I would say, but things just didn't feel quite as joyful as previous years. I was beginning to think it was just the natural cynicism of being a teenager, but I was quickly proven wrong when the head camp counselor David stood up and made an announcement to the boys' bus. "Alright, gentlemen, glad to see you all back." He cupped his hands together, his dark brown beard making his chin appear more chiseled. Over the winter, one of our counselors, Tegan, sadly passed away from a heart attack while preparing the cabins for the summer. So we all need to just respect his legacy and be kind to one another, and try our best to have some fun this year. That would be great. It's what he would have wanted. I shifted my attention to Roscoe, who was in the seat next to me. He was the first person that I had ever met when I started going to this camp, what felt like an eternity ago. We had hit it off pretty quickly, after both complaining how much we missed things like private showers and dark game consoles back at home. A heart attack? Tegan was barely old enough to drink, he questioned, but still holding back enough as to not speak negatively or disrespectfully about the dead man. "Stuff happens, man. It may seem strange, but we just gotta accept it," I replied, nodding my head towards the front of the bus. "Do you think that maybe there was something out there that stressed him out enough to cause a heart attack?" I swung my head like a startled bird back over to Roscoe, my expression becoming sour and slightly distasteful. "Dude, don't make a conspiracy out of it. I'm serious. He was a healthy guy, in good shape, very young. It just doesn't add up that he would go out like that." "I wouldn't stress about it. Let's just do as David says and try to have a good time. We don't need to investigate." "I will, but at the same time, I'm gonna try and get to the bottom of this," Roscoe said with such conviction that it came off as hyperbolic. "Okay then, Mr. FBI," I mocked, unable to take him seriously in the moment. The rest of the bus ride after that was fairly quiet. Roscoe had his head buried in a survival book that he had brought with him as one of his luxury items. And no, kids weren't allowed to bring their phones. I had brought my bow and arrow, seeing as I was very interested in archery. I had gone into many competitions when I was a younger kid, and my dad had always taken me hunting during the bow season. I didn't really catch too many things, but it was still fun and exciting nonetheless, at the prospect of snagging a trophy. Plus, getting in some experience couldn't hurt. But after some silent staring out the back window of the bus, and seeing the girls' bus behind ours, Roscoe's words started to seep back into my mind like leaking water, and I thought that maybe he was correct. It's just not really a common thing for someone young, healthy, and in good shape to just up and randomly have a heart attack. Now, I do believe that coincidences exist, but I couldn't help but think that this may not have been one of those exceptions to the rule. Not that I was going to tell Roscoe and give him the satisfaction of being correct. He gets that far too often already. The mostly silent riders of the bus erupted again once we pulled into the entrance of the forest path. The trees, grass, and bushes were greener than ever. There were logs, branches, hills, rocks scattered all over. The entropy of it all was beautiful. "Alright, I know most of you know the drill. We gotta get off soon and hike a mile to the cabins," David announced, gripping his consular whistle. There were immediate groans following his statement. I just kinda wrote them off as being lazy. I honestly enjoyed the hike to the cabins and seeing all the wildlife and nature surrounding us. It's not that bad. Plus, the exercise will be good for all of you. He smiled, his enthusiasm quite infectious. Not many people could deny that. I heard someone more towards the middle of the bus complain that their legs were already dead, which just goes to show you that just because someone goes to camp doesn't mean they actually like the outdoors. Some people's parents just thought that they should do something other than sit in the house all day. It took us about 10 minutes to finally load everyone and everything off the bus. The girls and guys were now mixed together for the time being, but I just stayed with Roscoe out of tradition. The forest around the path looked even more dense than it had before, as if Mother Nature was getting greedy with her decoration. Throughout the hike, branches crunched, leaves shook, and the wind howled as it passed through the trees of the woods. The bright sunlight made it seem beyond peaceful, and it was now somewhat calming my nerves and negative energy. "Keep your eyes out for monsters," Roscoe whispered to me as we marched forward, slightly crouching down as he walked. "Dude, the only monsters out here are bears. We're fine. And if you don't stop acting weird, then maybe you'll get eaten by one." Imagine how many girls I could get if I caught a monster though. I would be drowning in put. Okay, chill out," I snapped, cutting him off as fast as possible, not wanting to engage in that kind of discussion. For the rest of the hike, Roscoe went on telling me all about how he was going to catch a potential monster, and going over some traps that he would set up and the bait that he would use. I was just scared that he would end up being the bait for some dangerous wild animal. After deciding that I had had enough, I just ended up tuning him out. All the monster talk was beginning to irritate me, as much as I was curious about what had really happened to Tegan. I just highly doubt a monster was the thing that gave him a heart attack. I didn't exactly not believe in the otherworldly and the supernatural, but at the same time, I'm not someone who invests large amounts of time on conspiracies and things that seem wildly absurd. So, I was at a crossroads with myself. I slid a hand on my face and just took a breath, one that was a combination of stress and frustration. All the discussion rubbed up even more as the girls were informed of Tegan's death. They had seemed just as shocked and honestly sad as we were, but I didn't blame them. His death was far too sudden and unusual. But getting back onto the subject, I had wondered why they hadn't told us much sooner through email. Usually when events that would have a big impact on the way camp was run happened, we were all informed as soon as possible, parents and the kids alike. I mainly brushed it off as them making a simple mistake. But it's not just the counselors. What about the headquarters and superiors that had this stuff run by them immediately? Maybe they were hiding something from us. I nearly slapped myself because of the paranoia. I was beginning to sound exactly like Roscoe, and as much as I liked him, I really didn't want that to be the case. With the loud announcement of Counselor David, we had finally arrived at the location of the cabins. "We're here," he shouted. His excitement couldn't be matched by any of the rest of us, even the other counselors. Some of the other guys even began to whoop, as if they were doing some sort of dancing ritual around a fire, as if they were a clan. I honestly found it pretty funny, and it was the little lighthearted chuckle that I needed from how this trip was going so far. I want the top bunk this time. Roscoe shoved me as the cabin emerged more and more clearly from between the trees. No, you know the deal. I get the top bunk. Well, duel it for me then, I huffed, now beginning to humorously smile. Duel? Dude, this isn't Mortal Kombat. We could make it Mortal Kombat. He pressed on his attempt to win the top bunk. At this point, the girls began to split off to go to set up their cabin, which was about 300 feet from the boys, for obvious reasons. Roscoe continued in his ridiculous conquest against me, although at the end of the day, it was a big joke. I found myself actually feeling like I was competing for food or something essential, rather than just a top bunk in a cabin for a summer camp. I just wrote it off as my brain mistaking playful for threatening. It had taken about an hour for the boys and girls to finally finish setting up their cabins, unpacking their bags, getting all their gear and equipment for sports and activities. Roscoe and I had taken it upon ourselves to march up and down the area of the cabin in order to gather up enough of the guys to get a football game going. Once we had about 10, we went down to a more open part of the forest not too far from the cabin, with less trees and more flat ground for some good land to play on. The group that we had gotten together was seemingly quite competitive. We played up multiple games in order to thoroughly test which team was better. I ended up playing quarterback for the first couple of downs, but quickly got tired of getting sacked hard as hell by some of the bigger kids. There were many celebrations after touchdowns, good passes and catches. Overall, it was a well-off and enjoyable experience. Although one of the guys got a little too competitive and quit playing out of pure frustration. On one of the passes, Roscoe had ended up throwing the ball much harder than what was necessary for the distance of the pass. The ball ended up soaring out of the open area and into the more thick, dense part of the forest, where all the trees, bushes, and rocks were at their most abundant. I'll get it, I volunteered, seeing as the pass was meant for me anyway. All the other boys had looked at me as if I was crazy, but it wasn't like I was going very far. It was only about 20 feet deep into the forest opening. Once I had stepped in and snapped some branches underneath my feet, an eerie feeling of dread began to run through my veins. Suddenly, the other boys' crazy look didn't seem so out of place. Things just felt off, but impossible to explain. I pressed on nonetheless and just kept walking in order to get the football. I stepped on something with my right foot with a strange texture you didn't come across often in a forest. It felt flat and smooth, like a hard stick of butter. I cursed out of confusion, and then looked down at what the thing was underneath my foot. Stepping off to the side, I saw what appeared to be a book of some sort. The cover was just a plain brown with some sort of leather strap going across the spine and back. The leather strap made me quickly come to the conclusion that the strange book was a journal. I first walked over and grabbed the football and picked up the journal on my walk back out. But I took care in making sure to hide the journal by sliding it into the brim of my pants and covering the rest of it with my shirt. "Hey, you got it." One of the boys tapped me on the shoulder. "It took you long enough," he followed up sarcastically. I brushed off his comment, telling him that I was gonna go practice some archery with my bow and arrow, which of course was a lie. I needed to read this journal. My first thought was to tell Roscoe, but he of all people would go absolutely nuts at something like this, so I decided it was best to keep it from him. I kept marching away from the open clearing, and once I was far enough to declare the coast was clear, I forced off the leather strap around the journal and popped it open. At the top of the first page, it was dated back to January 29th, several months ago. But this was around the time maintenance would come out to work in the cabins and prepare the camp area for the summer. There was a signature toward the bottom of the page, and it was a symbol. A symbol that was also drawn on the back cover of the book. But I know this symbol. It isn't demonic or anything like that. But it's a symbol that I saw Tegan always make back when we did arts and crafts during the earlier years of camp. This is the counselor Tegan's journal. But why was it out here if he was working in the cabins? I scanned the page and began reading. Construction and repairs cut short today. A couple of the guys saying something about hearing lots of weird sounds coming from the forest. They're just being babies. Gonna continue in the morning. That first paragraph was slightly chilling, I will admit. But those sounds might have been something like a bear or some dying wildlife. Although, just that paragraph was the only entry for at least that day. The next didn't appear until February 2nd. Haven't slept well the past couple nights. Been hearing a weird-ass pattern of knocking on my door. Don't want to open it though. When I try asking who it is, they don't answer and just continue knocking. Maybe it's one of the guys messing with me. This is where my chills started to turn into more of a hardcore dread. I could feel my hands shake ever so slightly as I continued holding the journal in them. The next entry appeared on the next day over and was dated just 2 days later on February 4th. The other guys are acting paranoid out of their mind, and I don't get it. Paula screamed in the middle of the night for the second time, but won't tell anyone why. I'm starting to think that we need to wrap this damn thing up. At that point, I had finally decided to end up closing the journal and saving the rest for another time. Not to mention, reading it alone in the middle of the woods just added fuel to the fire that was the chills going up my spine. When I started to march out of the woods and back to the cabins, I had noticed that my legs were subconsciously moving faster than usual due to the inner tension that had been created from reading the journal. Once I finally made it back to the cabin, I went inside to grab my bow and arrow in order to head out and find a good spot in the forest for archery practice. I figured it was going to help ease the chilling feeling within me, and I'll admit, I felt much better to have it with me. It didn't take me very long to find a good spot out in the forest. I brought about 6 arrows with me. I didn't think I would need many if I was just practicing. Plus, having to collect a whole bunch at a time was a weight load that I definitely didn't need added on what I was already carrying. Once I had picked out my spot in the trees for practice, I set down my 5 other arrows and set up my bow, keeping one of the arrows in hand and lining it up with the strings of the bow. I licked my lips, took a deep breath, and positioned myself as precisely as possible, putting some distance between my feet. I pulled back the arrow and tightened it up before closing one eye and aiming. I let go and the immediate whoosh sound of the arrow blasting through the air struck my ears like lightning. The arrow dug firmly into the wood of the tree trunk and became completely stationary in what seemed like nanoseconds. I even nearly hit the tree dead center as well. Still got it, I announced to myself, bending down to the right in order to pick up another arrow. And to my unwelcome surprise, there was a large mosquito that had perched itself on the tip of one of my arrows, and it was a big one. Not freak of nature big, but big enough to make a person groan in disgust. I hesitated for a second before using my right hand to swat it away, not wanting it to bite me while I was practicing. The aftermath of a bite from something like that seemed like it would itch for eternity, and that was the last thing that I wanted. I've always hated bugs so much, not that it's an unpopular opinion or anything. Once the mosquito had finally departed, I picked up another arrow and began to load it into my bow, when I saw something that stopped all my movements cold. When I looked back at the tree that just seconds ago had an arrow that I had shot in its trunk, the arrow was gone. The indent in the trunk was still there, but the arrow itself had vanished as if it never had left my bowstrings. I looked around to find no living creature within the area of the woods but myself. I was alone. So what in the living hell could have snatched my arrow without me hearing it under 10 seconds? I'll admit, I began to internally freak out. I stood still after scanning the forest, but stayed very quiet, just in case something was stalking me. With every single movement that I performed, I did my best to stay as quiet as possible, not wanting to even make a branch crack underneath my feet. "Hey, you alright out here, man?" I heard the sound of Counselor David's voice call out to me. He was standing about 50 feet away from me between a couple of trees. The sun was beginning to set and the evening dusk was falling upon the area. "Yeah, I'm okay," I called back, although it was debatable to how honest that answer actually was. "Well, it's starting to get dark out, so how about you come back to the cabin?" He frowned. His face gave off the implication that he was unsettled like me. I didn't bring up the arrow or journal to him, of course. "Okay, just give me 1 second, let me collect all my stuff," I replied, bending over to pick up the stack of arrows, although it was lighter due to one of them being missing. Once we had made it back to the cabin and I had gotten ready for bed, I planned to go through more of the journal. And if you're wondering, yes, I did end up getting the top bunk. Tomorrow, we were going to have a big campfire instead of going to bed right away. Although for some reason, Roscoe had never gotten in the bottom bunk. I figured he was out somewhere fooling around. Typical Roscoe. When I flipped through Tegan's journal, picking up where I previously left off, things had only become more and more disturbing. Ended up having to leave the cabin, hearing too many voices telling me to do weird stuff. Pitched a tent and the voices have stopped for now. The next entry I read was seemingly the final one. I flipped through the rest of the journal and found nothing else written. So that seems to confirm it. It sees me. It wants me. I hear something coming. This is it. I need to run. I need to get the heck out of here. It's not worth it anymore. If you read this, stay away. I irresponsibly slammed the journal closed after that. To my surprise, none of the other guys in the cabin had woken up, but Roscoe was still missing from his bed. But I couldn't stay in this bed. I needed to move around. I was shaking too heavily, and my blood pressure was far too high. I pulled the covers off of me and climbed down the ladder off the bed, putting on my shoes to avoid walking around on the cold wood finish of the cabin floor. I crouched down and kept as quiet as possible, not wanting to awake anyone. My movements were quick, but silent as I crept through the cabin. I had remembered the route due to all the previous summers that I had spent here, so finding my way wasn't much of an issue. I made my way to the main foyer of the cabin. It was unusually dark. I used a flashlight that I had stolen from Roscoe's bunk in order to be able to see what I was doing. Soon enough, it was clearly shown to me that turning on the flashlight was a mistake. When I looked out the main window of the cabin, I saw the light of what appeared to be a fire going. A controlled one, of course, but a fire nonetheless. Who snuck out just to start a fire? I put my hand on the knob of the front door and slowly turned it, but putting in the effort to open the door quickly to avoid any squeaking or creaking noises that would alert a counselor to my presence. Once the door was open, I quickly closed it behind me, and I was now out to the front porch of the cabin. It was dark like the inside, but that wasn't what made me nearly shit myself. On the front porch deck was the arrow that had disappeared during my earlier archery practice. It looked the same way that I had left it, until I saw what was on the tip of the arrow. On the tip of the arrow was the severed head of Roscoe. His facial expression was terrifying. His mouth was wide open, and his eyes firmly matched that, being opened as much as they possibly could, indicating that he had died in great fear, terror, and agony. I turned to the side, away from the arrow, and vomited right then and there on the deck. The sound of the crickets and eerie hums of the forest were drowned out by the sound of my upchucking. After a couple of pounds of puke had left my body on the deck, I wiped my mouth and put my flashlight down while I regained myself. I closed the eyes on Roscoe's head, holding out hope that it would allow him to rest in peace. Who, or more likely, had done that to Roscoe? Why did it do that? Was it the same thing that had probably taken Tegan's life? I told him. I had told Roscoe not to go on this monster hunt. I should have told him about the journal. He would still be alive if it wasn't for my ignorance. I wanted to inflict a harsh punishment on myself, but I knew that it was useless. I had turned and tried to open the door to enter back into the cabin, but it was locked from the inside and I was now trapped outside. So, my only option was to make it over to the fire and see that if it would bring me some safety in what was now becoming a literal nightmare. I didn't even take my time being delicate with sneaking over to the fire. I simply sprinted and jumped on the steps of the cabin. I hit the ground in a full-on leg-pumping run, putting every ounce of strength I had into going as fast as possible. And as I expected, branches snapped, leaves crunched, and rocks were thrown out of place. I had covered the ground in a reasonable amount of time, and looked down as I caught my breath and let my face cool off. I was never exactly good at running, but I was competent enough to get through all the exercises in gym classes and perform decently enough in football. When I had finally looked up at the fire, there was a makeshift rotisserie with the stick spinning on its own over the fire. The mass on the stick was the rest of Roscoe. It stayed on the stick perfectly as it was rotated over the fire. His mass was charred, which told me his body had been cooked for a decent amount of time at this point. My heart nearly exploded when I felt the breathing of something behind me. It was large, tall, and it definitely didn't sound human in the slightest. Its voice had an extreme rasp despite being only of average pitch, yet the wavelengths of it reverberated within its own throat, giving the voice its own sinister echo. It even chuckled as it taunted me. It could clearly sense that I was paralyzed in fear, and it enjoyed that. Whatever the entity was, it got very, and I mean very close to my left ear before saying, "Would you like a slice?"